Dr. Tegan Blaine is the Director of Climate, Environment, and Conflict at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Prior to joining USIP in 2020, she served as a Vice President on a climate change initiative at the National Geographic Society. She also led the climate change team in USAID's Bureau for Africa for over a decade, where she developed USAID's strategy and investment plan for its climate change work in Africa, and built and led a team that provided thought leadership and technical support to USAID's Africa missions. Before USAID, Dr. Blaine worked on climate change and international development at McKinsey & Company, served as a policy advisor on water at the U.S. Department of State, and taught math and physics as a Peace Corps volunteer in Tanzania. Dr. Blaine has a doctorate in oceanography and climate from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography and a bachelor's degree from Brown University. She has taught about climate change and international development at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs and at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Take it away.
Thanks so much for that intro, Tara. And I thought that I was going to be the third panelist among a group and that you all might be sick of PowerPoint by then. So I had figured that I'd stay away from PowerPoint. I hope that's okay now that I've jumped in and moved to the second panelist. Anyway, right now I work at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and I just wanted to say a word about that before I get going. The USIP is a national, nonpartisan, independent institute. It was founded by Congress and is dedicated to the proposition that a world without violent conflict is possible, practical, and essential, both for U.S. and global security. The Institute works at the very local level with local partners to prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflict. But it also works with governments and civil societies to build local capacity to manage conflict peacefully by linking research, policy, training, analysis, and direct action. Now, you might be wondering why you have a former climate scientist working at a place like this. But I want to tell you a little bit about how climate change is turning into risks of conflict on both, well, basically from the local to very global scales through a discussion of two major issues. One, the transition to a global green economy, and two, the impact of climate change on human displacement and migration. So let me start first with the transition to a global green economy. We have often assumed, or at least I did before I got into this field, that the transition to green energy was primarily an economic and technical transition, not necessarily one related to conflict. However, that's not exactly true. Last year within the UN negotiations on climate change, the focus was heavily on how countries are going to be getting to net zero emissions over the next few decades. However, the UN negotiations also ended with countries being asked to put practical plans in place over the next few years and come back to the negotiations next year with an idea of what they're going to do between now and 2030. All of a sudden, once the focus becomes the short term rather than the long term, issues of conflict are suddenly a lot more important than they have been in the past. There are three major risks of conflict that I'd like to call out and that I think are really critical for us as a global community, not just as scientists, not just as policymakers, but kind of the global community and policy community to be thinking about as we move forward in this transition. The first one is the risk of political destabilization in oil-producing countries. In many oil-producing countries, there are political alliances that are built around the money generated from the sales of fossil fuels. We have recently at USIP been working with a group of grantees from the University of Tufts, and they are researchers who have been investigating what happens when countries are forced to rapidly decarbonize and move away from fossil fuel generation, and what that has meant for those countries. And what they have discovered is a little bit alarming. So for example, when Sudan lost access to the production facilities in South Sudan, it turned to income by utilizing its army as mercenaries in conflicts in Libya and Yemen. And so the fact that Sudan lost the oil reserves in South Sudan immediately helped destabilize other countries, because as Sudan started to try to generate more income that was lost because of fossil fuel production, they generated that income by basically selling out their military, which contributed to regional instability across the region. In contrast, Nigeria turned to development banks for new loans, which fueled corruption that kept government monies flowing into the pockets of political elites. So a different way of dealing with this. But then I'd also like to use the example of Angola. In 2017, its crude oil sector provided close to 65% of its tax revenues and over 95% of its exports. Yet Angola spends only about 5% of its GDP on social services, which is less than many of its peers in sub-Saharan Africa and far from what is required to build the human capital necessary to transition an economy away from reliance on oil. There's a risk assessment firm called Verisig Maplecroft, and they predict that Angola, Chad, Iraq, Nigeria, Algeria as well, are all among the countries most at risk of a slow motion wave of political instability over the next 3 to 20 years. They're the countries that are not investing in the necessary institutional, human, and infrastructural capacity to diversify and are less politically stable. All of these countries and many others have failed to use the last years to invest in their people, and they don't have the financial cushions to help as well as they transition to a global green economy and what the local impacts are. But there are two other risks of conflict associated with this transition that I'd like to talk about. In terms of number two, as new minerals are sought to support a green economy, many of those new minerals are also located in fragile countries. So when we're talking about green technologies such as solar panels, wind turbines, energy storage, electric vehicles, all of these are going to rely on some key minerals. The International Institute for Sustainable Development highlights 23 of them at the moment. And demand for these, including things like lithium and cobalt, could surge by 500% by 2050. Many of the known reserves of these resources are located in what we consider fragile countries that are very prone to conflict, and that are countries that suffer from often corrupt governance and frequent violent conflicts. This rising demand is likely to shift a whole lot of things, but as you see the mining industry go after these minerals, it's very likely that there are going to be localized conflicts that arise from this. These are countries that have weak social and environmental laws. They're countries that have high levels of corruption. They are countries that have major development challenges. And in addition, national governments and those who run them often protect multinational mining operations as easy sources of very lucrative taxes. And so they often have few incentives to protect local communities from being harmed or even destroyed by mining. Governments loosen or ignore environmental regulations and land tenure rights to protect those mines, even when they pollute water, soil, and air and displace people. And so already the mining community has been associated with a whole range of conflicts over public health issues associated with pollution, over labor disputes, over displacement of people, over land disputes, and how the benefits of these mines are often not flowing back to the communities, even when they have been promised benefits. But it's not just a mining issue, interestingly enough. It's also implementation of green technologies, which is causing conflict. especially over land rights and issues like benefit sharing. We're already seeing places like Kenya, which is really trying to implement significant wind energy. And yet that wind energy implementation requires land for all of the wind energy. Oftentimes the wind technologies are going into places where the local people don't have access to grid energy. And access to grid energy can really be an important economic boost for them because access to energy is associated with significant growth in GDP and other things. And so there are issues over land rights. Many, especially poor communities, don't necessarily have documented land rights. And so it's very easy for government and companies to make claims on land. And there are also issues about how the benefits from these kinds of energy sources are being shared with the communities. Kenya has recently seen major deals on wind canceled because of local conflict. And so these conflicts at the very local level have ramifications even for country level deals. And so the last major area of conflict that I'd like to highlight from the transition to the global green economy is around geopolitical competition. We're already seeing China go after reserves of cobalt in the DRC. We recently saw Tesla and Swiss interests compete for access to a major nickel mine in New Caledonia, which led to political contests, strikes, and a change in government. The US is, to be perfectly honest, behind the times in terms of thinking about what strategic access to some of these minerals means for us as a country. But I am sure that geopolitical competition will dominate the green energy sector and is a very stark reality about the future that faces us. So at this point, I'd like to set aside the transition to the green energy or transition to kind of a global green energy future and start looking a little bit at the potential for human migration and displacement under climate change. Climate change impacts are likely already forcing populations to migrate. And it is a trauma that I personally think is set to explode in scale over the next few generations and that we as a global community are poorly prepared to address. Most people won't say that they are moving due to migrate or due to climate change. It's really hard to draw a direct causal linkage between climate change and people's individual choices to move. However, I think that we are going to see that the knock-on impacts and kind of thinking about how climate change relates to human security and how human security relates to choices about displacement are really going to be important. Those have implications for political stability, for conflict, especially in urban areas as they expand, as well as for areas where there is a greater and greater sense of a lack of hope, and people may be trapped where they are and unable to get out even when they want to. So taking a step back, we already recognize that climate change is likely to jeopardize human security. Climate change is having impacts on food security, water security, even health security. And historically, for thousands of years, migration, whether it's temporary or permanent, has been a way for human society to adapt to environmental change. And so migration isn't necessarily a negative. It's actually a very important form of adapting to environmental change. However, even if we don't fully understand all of the dynamics that go into an individual's decision to move, I do think that we are going to be experiencing greater and greater displacement, and many of those individual choices are going to have regional impacts, so affecting several countries at once in similar ways. We already know that disasters that are linked to changing climate, such as storms, floods, droughts, heat emergencies, fires, often lead to conflict and violence by threatening people's sense of stability. But longer term trends also reduce accessible water supplies and crop yields, all changes that risk further violence. Poorer countries often don't have the resources to manage these times of changes and probably face the greatest hazard. And the impact of climate change also threatens the development gains of recent decades in many countries. So what we're seeing already is that the increased vulnerability of fragile countries to both disasters and violence have already contributed to the displacement of the highest number of people worldwide that has ever been recorded. That's about 82 million. And half of those people now live in urban areas. Research also suggests that climate changes are accelerating the problem of rural people losing livelihoods, such as farming and herding, and now they're making the difficult decision to leave home to survive. So 62% of migrant families surveyed in India, Bangladesh, and Ghana cited economic difficulties as the primary reason for leaving their homes, and 80% associated environmental factors with more insecure livelihoods. We're also looking at a future where, in the absence of migration, an estimated 30% of the global population in 2070 will live in areas that experience a mean annual temperature currently only found on less than 1% of the Earth's surface. Now, this is in the absence of migration. But rising temperatures in the subtropics have already exceeded the 35 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperature, beyond which severe heat-related impacts are possible. And human society, as we know it, becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. Oman, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and northern South Asia include millions of people who face the most extreme high temperatures. But this crisis is also likely to lead to region-wide displacement and migration in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America. The World Bank projects that within Sub-Saharan Africa alone, climate change will likely force between 57 million and 86 million people to migrate from their homes by 2050. Now that's local migration. That's displacement within a country, potentially across a region. It doesn't necessarily mean that these migration flows are going to be going across significant geographies. But there are also other analytics that suggest that climate events are statistically correlated with human migration. And so we are already seeing that there are correlations there, even if people aren't actually articulating that that's the reason that they're leaving. And that kind of displacement is also often correlated with increases in social and economic tensions and the risks of violence if migrants aren't integrated into their host communities, the receiving communities. Many people first experience climate impacts through water supply, and climate change could significantly alter the flow of water in major river systems that cross borders, such as the Indus and the Brahmaputra in South Asia, or the Africa's Nile. I see that Dr. King is now online, and so he'll be able to talk with you a lot more about the impact of water and how it intersects with security issues. But I think that it's important to recognize that climate change is already exacerbating the existing challenges of fragile states and increasing the risk of violent conflict as well. There's an estimate looking at several different studies that says that climate change has increased the risk of armed conflict within countries by anywhere from 3 to 20% over the previous century, and that's likely to rise as climate change advances. And so people will be facing human security issues, people will be facing an increase in armed conflict, and so these two issues are likely to come together to lead to displacement. In my last couple minutes, I'd like to say something about urbanization as well. Rapid urbanization, especially in the global south, has already heightened the risks of uprisings in cities as growing populations strain government services and widen inequalities. In cities with concentrated populations, groups with grievances often organize more easily for collective action. And so it's likely that climate change will exacerbate these dynamics with destabilizing consequences, not only for cities, but also nations and regions. And it's in the urban slums that climate and migration and urban growth kind of intersect. A disproportionate share of migrants move from rural regions to seek employment in cities, but find themselves living in slums that are vulnerable to floods, landslides, and other effects of climate change. And this in turn increases the risks of violent conflict in cities and can lead people to migrate out of their home countries altogether. So in Central America, climate change and the increase in extreme events such as hurricanes has played an important role in driving rural people to migrate to cities. But then what happens is urban violence encourages migrants to leave again, sometimes to international destinations. And so recent research from Mexico shows that while lack of economic opportunities figures large in migrants' explanations about why they migrate, it's that personal exposure to violence that drives their actual decision to leave, which is another consideration that we need to be aware of. And I mentioned quickly before, but I do think it's worth mentioning again, that there are people who are going to be left behind as well, whether willingly or because they don't have the resources to move. And these people in very difficult environments are going to face additional stresses. We may never be able to fully quantify the risk of conflict or the amount of displacement and migration due directly to climate change, but it's likely to increase the need for safe migration options, increase stresses on already vulnerable geographies and cities, and increase demand on everything from social services to military intervention requests to reestablish stability in certain areas. And so I think the goal of my presentation today was just to share a little bit about how climate change is increasing the risk of conflict in really, really important ways, and just emphasize for you that climate change is not just a scientific issue. It's an issue that has intense ramifications, not just for individuals' lives, but how we as a global society and a group of countries who need to cooperate together to survive in this world actually work together on a whole set of issues. So with that, I'll stop and hand it back to Tara to introduce our last speaker.